Thank you, Tid, and thanks for the opportunity to present our perspective on this important, critically important opportunity for patients across the EU to benefit from evidence-based decision-making, and what we believe a significant opportunity to have more timely decisions, and eventually increased opportunities for more timely access across the EU, which we know is a key objective of the EU pharmaceutical strategy. Now, this is based on the assumption that this new system will lead to a predictable EU assessment process of clinical evidence, predictable at the EU level and at the country level, that there will be clear and more coherent clinical evidence requirements than what we see today across the EU. So there is a degree of harmonization of the requirements, and that leads to clarity and ultimately also a more efficient production of such relevant clinical evidence that meets the needs of all decision makers. So if we achieve this, I think we would have made already a major step forward. We believe that this requires more specifically that the joint assessments will focus on what's commonly required in the member states, just this common core of assessment in order to ultimately lead to a more workable and efficient process overall. It's critically important that these clinical assessments are well integrated into national decision-making process. What's the benefit if we all work together and have not a clear understanding of how the resulting important evidence-based work will inform decisions at national level? We believe that stakeholders, health technology developers, patients, clinicians, and also other experts are involved in setting up the framework. So that's part of the stakeholder network that Maya Matthews introduced, but also in the various assessments throughout the assessment process and also the other processes that will be orchestrated by the future coordination group. In order to deliver this, I think it's critically important that EU HTA processes are adequately resourced. And we heard at the beginning about one important process here, which is the so-called joint scientific consultations, which help us to understand what evidence is required, ideally early in the process. We understand this is the first critical phase to shape future assessments. And so it's important that companies can have access to this process, and that other stakeholders, experts, participate in this and are invited. That requires resources. So we are looking forward to help in any way to secure these resources in member states at EU level, and also through frameworks that are workable for patients and other stakeholders and experts. What are the challenges that we face? Now, preparing for such a submission takes a long time. The submission for a new molecule takes about 12 months. For a company. So that would mean that we have, in early 2024, ideally, a good understanding of how the details of this future framework look like. This would allow companies to prepare. They would not have necessarily had the chance to have participated in joint scientific consultations, but at least they have an understanding of what this framework looks like. So we clearly should not approach 25 to 30, these years of introduction, as experimentation years. And so we should really build on experience we gathered in many pilots of joint actions in the past, also the learnings from there, and see that we have implementing delegated acts available as early as possible to clarify what's required. As you know, there is still, at this stage, significant uncertainty, which makes it difficult for us to explain in the companies what's really needed. What do we specifically need in order to prepare for this process? But here, we are committed to work and to contribute in the co-creation of the system, as mentioned and established here by Maya Matthews. We want to work with the stakeholders constructively to share experience, thinking, ideas, proposals on how to optimally prepare. I think some of the larger countries have prepared for this. So certainly in Germany, we've seen this significant work of the health system to introduce or find ways to understand what's needed to prepare for these reports. But we see also many smaller countries that have difficulty to bring the resources together to plan for the introduction in their system. And I think here we need to put a lot of attention on how will this ever be used? Are there specific requirements to change processes in these countries? Here, EFPIA as an organization, also of other national associations, is able to support with the national introduction that we have here. Yeah, maybe I stop here. Mention again, we are committed to constructively contribute in all of the next phases of the introduction of this important new system.
Thank you, Ansgar. Obviously, you have touched upon the topic of how EFPIA is preparing and your members, but could you be more specific maybe on what are your main focuses? What are your main, you have already mentioned the insight you have in the situation in member states, the differences in preparedness, which obviously the Commission also recognizes. There are challenges for smaller countries for two reasons. Once it's the sheer capacity available of people who can be involved in an HTA process is quite limited. It is important to stress that, of course, this does not apply only to pharmaceuticals, but also to other technologies, which should also be mentioned. Of course, we have you here as the representative of EFPIA, so we are focusing in this discussion on medicines. But of course, there are other technologies that also will be subject to these assessments. And secondly, the smaller countries and some of the member states, of course, are more challenged in terms of the expenditure they can have on medicines in general. And so they would like to have instruments that would help them take solid decisions. In any case, how does EFPIA prepare itself for the phase of HTA introduction?
Thanks, Tate. Thanks for the opportunity to explain this a bit more in depth. Focus is on the individual companies here, and it's exactly mirrored as what we probably see on the side of the HTA regulation. You have large countries that have significant resources, you have large companies that have significant resources, but you also have very small companies, very few products, with very limited resources to plan for this. My company has started to plan more specifically at the end of 21, beginning of 22. So we are a year into this process. We set up work streams that work in parallel on a number of deliverables to secure that this organization, a large pharmaceutical company, is able to actively participate in this process. We need to understand that the companies have to establish this process in parallel to the existing processes that will continue until 2030. So it's not replacing one or the other. We have to build these processes in parallel. We need to review our portfolio to understand which are the products that will be in scope. We know it's oncology products. It's in 2025, ATMPs maybe. We need to get clarity on the concrete rules and proposals and try to understand what does this mean for us. The most challenging bit is to develop a new operational model as described, which is very cross-functional. It operates in a very critical time of a product lifecycle. It's when the regulatory process is running in parallel. It involves biostatisticians, it involves HTA experts, commercial functional clinical science experts. And we are currently here in my company, at least, developing on how and thinking about how this model could look like. We need to secure the internal resources for this process. And of course, we provide in the discussions with industry associations, but also in the public debate, like here, these inside perspectives into the process. So it's very similar. Large companies, like large countries, have more ability to prepare early. Smaller countries have being confronted now with the idea that probably do not yet really know what this ultimately means. EFPIA as an organization represents these companies and national associations. We will develop evidence, supportive evidence to illustrate, I think, our proposals, our ideas, and maybe also our concerns that we have with existing proposals, but all with the aim to have a workable process, ideally in 24, which is when countries have to start working on concrete product submissions. And then, of course, we provide the national associations, also those in smaller countries, for example, those in Slovenia, with help to understand what could this mean, this national implementation, what's expected, what's typically expected in countries to make this ultimately be useful in the national decision-making processes. Thank you.